Exiled at 14, she built a home inside an abandoned bunker. Arna Lindgren, who had survived 11 Dakota winters, told her bluntly, "When the real cold comes, you'll freeze in that hole, and every creature you've dragged down there will freeze with you." She had $3, no family within 500 miles, and a winter coming she had never seen. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. But 5 months earlier, Elsa Gunnarsdottir had never seen snow deeper than her ankles. She had arrived in Minnesota on a Tuesday in June, standing on a wooden platform in Sacred Heart, while farmers walked past and inspected her like livestock. 14 years old, thin arms, a dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to gray. The orphan train had carried her 1,100 miles from a Manhattan tenement where her parents had died coughing blood into rags, and now she stood in the sun while a woman named Mrs. Halvorsen pinched her arm to check for muscle. "She'll do," Mrs. Halvorsen said. "She can read. That's something." Reading! It was the only reason anyone had chosen her. The other children, the stronger ones, the boys, had been selected first. A farmer from Blue Earth County had taken one boy specifically because his shoulders were broad enough to plow. A woman from Marshall had chosen a girl of 16 because she looked old enough to cook for a harvest crew. Elsa was the remainder, the leftover, the one taken because she could write letters for a woman whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen. The Halvorsen farm sat 3 miles outside Sacred Heart in Wrenwood County, Minnesota. Flatland, endless grass, a sky so wide it made her dizzy. The frame house had 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen where Elsa slept on a straw pallet near the stove. She worked from before dawn until after dark, hauling water from a well 40 yards away, mending clothes until her fingers bled, helping Mrs. Halvorsen with the pregnancy that grew larger each week. She had never seen a horizon this wide. In New York, buildings blocked the sky. Here, the sky was everything. It pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't name. Mr. Halvorsen barely spoke to her. He was a large man with hands that could crush walnuts, and he looked at Elsa the way he looked at the plow horse, a tool that required feeding. His sister Agnes lived in the house as well, a sharp-faced woman of 48 who had never married and who watched Elsa with eyes that seemed to be waiting for a mistake. "Don't break the china," Agnes said every morning. "Don't burn the bread. Don't let the fire go out. Don't let the fire spread." Elsa didn't break or burn anything. She was careful. She had learned to be careful in the tenements where a single-drop candle could burn a building full of families. But being careful wasn't enough. 2 months. That was how long she lasted. On an August morning, Mrs. Halvorsen went into labor 3 weeks early. The midwife was 10 miles away. Agnes had gone to town for supplies. Mr. Halvorsen rode for help and didn't return for 6 hours. Elsa was alone with the screaming. She did everything she knew, boiled water, held Mrs. Halvorsen's hand, prayed in languages she barely remembered from her mother's lips. She tried to remember what the old women in the tenement had said about babies coming wrong. Turn the child, stop the bleeding. None of it made sense. None of it worked. Mrs. Halvorsen begged her, "Please, please, something's wrong inside me." The baby came wrong, feet first. The bleeding wouldn't stop. By the time Mr. Halvorsen returned with the midwife, his wife was dead. The baby, a girl, lived for 11 minutes. Elsa held her while she took her last breath, felt the tiny body go still in her hands. Agnes arrived an hour later. She found Elsa sitting on the porch, hands still red, staring at nothing. "You killed her," Agnes said. "You were supposed to help her, and you killed her." Elsa couldn't speak. She had no words for what had happened. She had held a dying woman and a dying child and been able to save neither. Mr. Halvorsen emerged from the house. His face was empty, Not angry, not sad, just empty, like someone had carved everything out of him. He looked at Elsa for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 crumpled bills and 2 coins. "Get out," he said. "Take what you earned and get out. If I see you again, I'll beat you like I'd beat a horse thief." "She didn't do anything," Agnes said, but there was satisfaction in her voice. "The Lord took my sister-in-law. This one just watched." "I don't care." Mr. Halverson's voice broke on the last word. "Get her out of my sight." $3.40. That was what 2 months of her life was worth. Elsa walked. She had nowhere to go, so she walked. West, because west was away from the Halverson farm. The sun set and rose and set again. She slept in tall grass and woke covered in dew that soaked through her dress. She ate nothing because she had nothing to eat. Her stomach cramped so badly she couldn't stand up straight. On the 3rd day, she found the hole in the ground. It sat on a low rise, half hidden by overgrown prairie grass. The entry had partially collapsed, timbers jutting at angles like broken bones. Earth had slumped over the top in a mound that looked almost natural, almost like a burial. Insects hummed around the opening. Elsa climbed down through the gap. Inside, the air was cool. The walls were earth-packed between log supports, massive cottonwood beams that must have taken a dozen men to place. The ceiling was more beams, 8 inches thick, covered with 4 feet of packed soil. The interior was dark and smelled of must and old fires. Debris covered the floor, broken bottles, rotted fabric, animal bones, the remnants of whoever had sheltered here before. But it was shelter. It was walls. It was something. Elsa sat in the darkness and did not move for a very long time. The bunker had been built in 1862, during the war with the Dakota. She learned this later, piece by piece, from people who had no reason to help her but sometimes told stories anyway. Fort Ridgely was 3 miles to the south. The Army had needed powder magazines and bomb-proof shelters to survive the siege of August 1862. 2 days of fighting that had killed soldiers and settlers and Dakota warriors alike. This structure had held ammunition, then soldiers, then nothing. When the Army abandoned the fort in 1867, the bunker was left to rot. Drifters had used it sometimes. Trappers. Once, according to the stories, a family fleeing creditors had spent a winter here before moving on to parts unknown. 20 years. The timbers had held for 20 years. Elsa did not know this history when she first crawled inside. She knew only that the space was approximately 12 feet by 18 feet, that the ceiling was just tall enough for her to stand, and that the air inside stayed cool even when August heat baked the prairie above. She began to clean. It took 2 weeks to clear the debris. She hauled broken glass and rotted wood and unidentifiable scraps up through the collapsed entry, handful by handful, until her palms were raw and bleeding. She found a corner that seemed stable and claimed it. She gathered dry grass and made a nest for sleeping. She scraped mud from the floor until she found packed earth that could be swept clean. The work kept her mind empty. That was the point. If she stopped working, she would think about Mrs. Halverson screaming, about the baby going still in her hands, about Mr. Halverson's empty face. So she didn't stop. On the 3rd day of cleaning, a man appeared at the entry. He was old, 50 at least, maybe 60, with a face weathered to leather and hands that looked like they could break rocks. He sat on his horse and stared down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he dismounted slowly, his knees cracking like dry wood. "Thought I saw smoke," he said. He had a trace of an accent, Swedish, maybe Norwegian. "Didn't believe it. Nobody lives in Lindgren's grave." "Lindgren's grave?" He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. That's what they call it. My name's on the damn thing. He walked closer, peering at the bunker entry with eyes that had seen too many winters. I buried my first wife in a hole like this. Roof collapsed in 1871, crushed her while she slept. 4 feet of earth and timber straight down on her chest. She didn't even scream. The words fell into silence. Nobody lives underground anymore, he said. We learned better. Elsa stood at the entry, blocking it without knowing why. I live here now. The man studied her. His eyes were gray, pale as frost. You're the orphan train girl, the one Halverson threw out after his wife died. She said nothing. Agnes Halverson's been telling everyone you killed her sister-in-law. Says you stood there and watched her bleed out. Says the devil sent you from New York to punish good Christian folk. He watched her face. Did you kill her? She bled. Elsa's voice came out flat. The baby came wrong. I couldn't stop it. Babies come wrong sometimes. Happens to animals, happens to people. Doesn't make it anyone's fault. He shook his head. But that's not my concern. My concern is you'll freeze in that hole, and come spring someone will have to drag out your body and bury it proper. I'll manage. No. The word was flat, final. You won't. I've survived 11 Dakota winters. You know what that means. 11 times the cold has tried to kill me, and 11 times I've beaten it. I've buried 2 wives to this prairie, one to a collapsed dugout, one to lung fever. I run the largest sheep operation in Renwood County, 84 head, and I've never lost more than 3 animals in a single winter because I know what winter does. He stepped closer, close enough that Elsa could smell the tobacco and sweat on him. Do you know what winter does? Elsa didn't answer. It kills, he said. It kills anyone who isn't ready, anyone who doesn't have enough wood, enough food, enough shelter. You want to survive winter, you need a proper cabin with walls that don't sweat and a roof that doesn't leak. You need 60 cords of firewood to burn from October through April, and you need a man to cut that wood because a woman alone can't swing an axe 8 hours a day without breaking. He gestured at the bunker, at the collapsed entry, at the earth piled above, at the darkness inside. You have none of those things. This isn't shelter. This is a grave. When the real cold comes, 40 below, 50 below, the kind of cold that freezes spit before it hits the ground, you'll freeze in that hole, and every creature stupid enough to follow you will freeze with you. The words hung in the air. He wasn't threatening her. He was simply stating facts as he understood them. That made it worse. I can take you to the county poorhouse, he said. New Ulm. It's 60 miles, but I can arrange transport. You'd have a roof, food, a bed. You'd survive. I've heard about the poorhouses. Heard what? Children die there. They get sick and no one notices until it's too late. They get beaten for stealing bread. They disappear in the night and no one asks questions. His face shifted, not denial exactly, more like acknowledgement of something he didn't want to name. The poorhouses were known quantities on the frontier. Everyone knew. No one spoke of it. Children die everywhere, he said finally, but they die faster in holes in the ground. He mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life there. My name is Arne Lindgren. My farm is 1.5 miles east. If you change your mind before the first snow, come find me. After the first snow. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He rode away without looking back. Elsa watched him until he disappeared over the rise. Then she returned to the bunker and continued cleaning. If she was going to die in a hole, at least it would be clean. September came. The nights grew cold. Elsa woke one morning to find frost on the grass outside and her breath visible in the bunker's interior. She had no blankets, no winter clothing, no way to make fire safely inside the earthen space. The walls were earth and logs. One spark could smolder for days without showing flame, then bring the whole structure down on her head. She lay on her grass nest and shivered and thought about Lindgren's words, thought about the poorhouse, thought about the baby going still in her hands. Then she noticed something. The frost had melted by mid-morning. The prairie above was warming in the sun. But inside the bunker, the temperature had barely changed. It was cool. It had been cool all night, but it was not freezing. The walls held a kind of warmth, a stored heat that seemed to radiate from the earth itself. She pressed her hand to the wall. Cool, but not cold. Not the killing cold of the air outside at dawn. She remembered the root cellars beneath the tenements in New York, dark spaces that smelled of dirt and potatoes. They never froze, even in January. The vegetables stored there survived the winter while the city above turned white with snow. The old women used to say, "The earth remembers summer. It holds warmth the way a grandmother holds a secret. Deep, quiet, reliable." Elsa found a flat stone and began to dig. She dug 6 inches down in the prairie soil outside the bunker and buried her last apple, a withered thing she'd found on a forgotten tree 2 miles south. 3 days later, she dug it up, frozen solid. The skin had turned brown and mushy. She dug deeper, down to her elbow, arm's length. She buried another scrap of food, a piece of rabbit she'd managed to snare with a loop of cord. 3 days. Still cool, not frozen. The earth holds warmth, she thought. The deeper you go, the more it holds. The bunker ceiling was 4 feet of earth, 4 feet of packed soil between her and the sky. If the earth at arm's length stayed unfrozen, then the mass above her was insulation no cabin could match. The earth was a blanket. The earth was a shield. But the bunker had gaps. The walls were cracked where logs had shifted. The entry had collapsed partly open, letting wind whistle through on cold nights. All the earth in the world couldn't help if the wind found its way through. She needed to seal it, every crack, every gap, every place where cold air could enter. She needed to make the earth her shelter instead of her grave. Marta Erickson arrived in late September, when the last warmth was fading from the prairie like color bleeding from a photograph. She was a widow, 42, with hands roughened by decades of dairy work and eyes that had seen husbands die and children bury. Her farm was a mile north, and she had come because she had seen smoke, the same smoke that had brought Lindgren, but her face was different than his, less judgment, more something else, curiosity maybe. "You're still here," Marta said. It wasn't a question. "I'm still here." Marta carried a basket covered with cloth. She set it on the ground near the bunker entry and didn't mention it. "Lindgren says you'll freeze. He's been telling everyone at the store. Says by January they'll find your body curled up like a frozen rabbit." Lindgren doesn't know everything. He knows winter. Marta looked at the bunker, at the earth piled above, at the logs jutting from the sides, at the darkness of the entry. "I came from Norway as a child, crossed the ocean at 6 years old, and nearly died twice before we reached land. My father built a house half in the ground when we settled in Wisconsin. The earth holds warmth, he used to say. The old ways work." Something sparked in Elsa's chest, a kind of recognition. "But earth also holds water," Marta continued. "That's what my father learned the hard way." "Water? Spring melt, heavy rain. The ground isn't just soil, it's rivers you can't see, underground streams that shift with the seasons. One good rain can turn walls to mud. One spring thaw can flood a dugout while you sleep. She paused. People have drowned in their beds, in their own homes, underground. The spark in Elsa's chest flickered. I'm not trying to frighten you, Marta said. I'm trying to help you understand. The earth can save you or kill you. It depends on how well you know it. Do you know this land? Do you know where the water flows? No. Elsa's voice was small. I don't know anything. Then you'll have to learn fast. Marta looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way no one had looked at her since she stepped off the orphan train. The basket has cheese and bread. You look like you haven't eaten in a week. I can't pay. You can work it off when you're able. I need help with the dairy sometimes. It's not charity, it's trade. She left without another word. Elsa opened the basket. The cheese was fresh, yellow, and sharp-smelling. The bread was still warm, wrapped in cloth that held the heat. She ate slowly, making each bite last as long as possible, and thought about water seeping through walls while she slept. October arrived with frost that didn't melt until noon. Elsa worked from dawn until dark, every day, without rest. Her task was simple to describe and brutal to execute. Seal the bunker. Make it hold warmth. Make it hold life. The walls had 47 gaps. She counted them, running her fingers along the logs in the darkness, feeling where cold air seeped through like water through a cracked dam. Each gap required clay. The creek bed a quarter-mile away had clay, gray-brown and sticky, and she dug it with her bare hands and carried it in her skirt. Mix with dried grass. Work it until it becomes smooth. Press it into the gaps. Pack tight. Wait for it to dry. Test for airflow by holding a candle near the patch and watching whether the flame flickers. Repeat. 47 gaps, some no wider than a finger, some as wide as her fist. Her hands cracked. The cold water and rough clay split her skin in places that wouldn't heal, deep fissures that bled and scabbed and split again every time she returned to work. She wrapped her palms in scraps of cloth torn from the hem of her dress and kept working. The dress grew shorter, the gaps grew fewer. Walls 30% sealed, walls 50% sealed, walls 80% sealed. The entry was worse. The collapse had left a gap 3 feet wide, open to the sky. Cold poured through it, every night like a living thing, hungry and searching. All her work on the walls meant nothing if the door was open. She needed timber to frame it properly. She had no timber. She had no axe to cut timber. She had no money to buy timber and no one who would sell it to her anyway. 3 miles south, the abandoned buildings of Fort Ridgely still stood, rotting but present. Elsa walked there on a morning when frost covered the grass like shattered glass. Her breath steamed, her fingers ached, but the fort was there, waiting. She found collapsed barracks, ruined stables, buildings that had stood for 30 years and were now slowly returning to the earth. And in the wreckage of one barracks, she found 3 cottonwood beams that had fallen from a roof but remained sound. 8 feet long, 6 inches in diameter. Heavy enough that she couldn't lift one off the ground. She could not carry them. She tied a rope around the first beam, a rope she had traded from Marta for half a day's labor, and dragged it. 3 miles. The beam scraped along the frozen ground, catching on rocks and roots. The rope cut into her shoulder, digging through the thin fabric of her dress until blood seeped through. She fell twice when her feet slipped on patches of ice. The second time, she couldn't get up for several minutes. She lay on the frozen ground and stared at the sky and thought about not moving. Then she thought about Mrs. Halverson dying while she watched, helpless. She got up, 1 beam per day, one shoulder destroyed, then the other. Her feet blistered inside her worn shoes, and the blisters broke, and she walked on raw flesh. But the beams arrived. 1, 2, 3. She set them as a frame around the entry. Header on top, supports on the sides, packed earth around the base. The opening shrank from 3 feet wide to 3 feet by 3 feet, small enough to close with a hide flap. She didn't have a hide. Marta Erickson came again in mid-October. She needed fence mending, she said. The work would take 4 days. Payment would be whatever's fair. Elsa mended fence for 4 days. Her hands bled onto the wire. Her back screamed from bending. But she mended every broken strand, every rotted post, every gap where Marta's cows might escape. When she finished, Marta gave her a deer hide, tanned, supple, large enough to cover the entry. "Found this in the barn," Marta said. "Must have been my husband's. No use to me." They both knew it was a lie. Neither mentioned it. Agnes Halverson found her in the Birch Coulee General Store on a morning when the first real cold was settling over the prairie. Elsa had walked 4 miles to buy salt, 4 miles in thin shoes, her feet wrapped in rags inside the leather. Salt was the last thing she needed. Without it, she couldn't preserve the rabbit meat that was her only reliable food source. She had 90 cents left from her original $3.40, having spent the rest on a knife, thread, and 2 candles. The salt cost 40 cents. She was reaching for the paper package when Agnes appeared at her shoulder. "You're not welcome here." Elsa turned. Agnes's face was sharp with something that had been building for 2 months, a hatred that had been fed and watered and tended like a garden. "I need salt," Elsa said quietly. "I don't care what you need." Agnes stepped closer. Other customers had stopped their shopping. The clerk behind the counter watched with wide eyes. "You killed my brother's wife. You killed my niece before she could take a single breath. And now you live in a hole in the ground like the animal you are, pretending you're something other than a city rat who brought death to decent people." The store had gone completely quiet. "Go back to New York," Agnes said. "Go back to whatever gutter produced you. You're not wanted here. You're not welcome here. And if God has any sense of justice, you won't survive to see spring." Elsa looked at the salt in her hand, looked at Agnes's face, the triumph there, the satisfaction of having an audience, looked at the other customers who avoided her eyes. She set down the salt. She turned. She walked out. 4 miles home in the cold. No salt. No way to preserve food. The rabbit she had snared would rot before she could eat it all. She made it back to the bunker as the sun was setting, her feet numb and bleeding inside their wrappings. She sat in the darkness and pressed her hands against the earth walls and felt the stored warmth that no one in that store understood. "They think I'm dying," she thought. "They're waiting for me to die." "The earth doesn't forget summer," she answered herself, "even when everything else does." November came hard. The first real snow fell on October 28th, 2 inches, melted within days, but a warning written in white across the prairie. The ground began to freeze. Clay work became impossible. The material turned stiff and crumbled when she tried to shape it. Elsa shifted focus. Interior preparation. A sleeping platform 18 inches off the floor, because cold air sinks and warm air rises. The platform was rough, boards salvaged from the fort, lashed together with cord, but it kept her body away from the coldest layer of air. Storage alcoves carved into the earth walls for food. Dried grass, 8 inches thick, lining the floor for insulation. She ate rabbit when she could catch it, roots when she couldn't, Marta's charity when there was nothing else. Her dress hung loose, her ribs showed when she washed in the cold creek. She was slowly starving, and she knew it, and she kept working because working was better than waiting. November 3rd. heavy rain. She heard it before she felt it, a roar on the roof above, water finding every crack, pouring through gaps she had missed in the initial ceiling. The entry overhang she had spent a week building collapsed in 30 seconds. Mud and timber and prairie grass cascaded into the bunker. 2 days of work. Gone. Elsa stood in the wreckage, water streaming down her face, mud splattered across her dress. She felt something break inside her. Not hope. She hadn't had hope since August. Something smaller. The belief that effort mattered, the faith that trying was enough. She sat in the mud and didn't move. An hour passed. Maybe 2. The rain stopped. The cold set in, creeping through her wet clothes, settling into her bones. She was going to die here. She understood that now, not quickly, not cleanly, but piece by piece. Starvation, or cold, or both. The skeptics were right. Lindgren was right. A girl in a grave couldn't survive. She should walk to the poorhouse. She should give up. She should accept that the world had decided what she was worth. $3.40, no more gigi, and stop pretending otherwise. She sat in the mud and thought about the children who died in poorhouses. The ones no one remembered. The bodies buried in unmarked graves because no one cared enough to carve a name. If she was going to die, she would die with her name. She stood up. Her legs shook. Her hands were numb. She began clearing the debris. November 7th, 4 degrees above zero at dawn. Marta Eriksson arrived with 2 draft horses and a sledge. The horses steamed in the cold air, their breath rising in plumes. Marta sat on the driver's seat wrapped in a wool blanket. "I need help moving hay," she said. "The work will take most of the day. Payment is labor for labor." The sledge happened to have a bundle of salvaged lumber strapped to the back. Good boards, straight and dry. The kind you couldn't find anymore unless you tore down an old building. Elsa stared at the lumber. "That's a lot to move for hay." "It's extra weight. Unbalances the sledge. I'll leave it by your place. Pick it up when you have time." "Marta, pick it up when you have time." Her voice brooked no argument. She drove the sledge to the bunker, unloaded the lumber near the entry, and drove away without looking back. Elsa stood in the cold and looked at the wood, enough to properly frame the entry, enough to build a real door. More than she could have earned in a month of labor given freely and disguised as inconvenience. Charity, pride preserved by careful lies. She accepted it because she had no other choice. She built the door, rough, uneven, but solid. She framed the entry with the salvaged boards. She sealed the last gaps with mud and grass and prayer. On November 8th, the temperature dropped to 18 degrees. Elsa slept in the bunker with the door closed and the hide flap secured. She woke warm. The interior held 46 degrees. Outside, frost coated everything, the grass, the ground, the trees along the creek bed. Inside, her breath barely steamed. The earth did not forget summer, even in November. But November was not January. Lindgren's words haunted her through the short days and long nights. Wait until the real cold, 40 below, 50 below. Then we'll see who's right. December arrived mild. Temperatures hovered near freezing, sometimes dipping to 10 or 15 below at night, never reaching the killing cold that old-timers whispered about. The old-timers remembered the hard winter of 1880 and 81, when snow fell for 7 months straight and the railroad stopped running. They remembered friends who had starved, children who had frozen. They knew this warmth was borrowed. They just didn't know how much. Elsa's bunker held. 44 to 52 degrees, steady as a heartbeat. She learned the rhythm of it. Cooler at night when she was alone. Warmer when she slept, and her body added heat to the space. The earth was a battery. It absorbed warmth during the day and released it through the long nights. She had survived. So far. But survival wasn't living. She had no money, no food stores beyond a few weeks, no future she could see. She was a girl in a hole, and even if she didn't freeze, she would eventually starve, or get sick, or simply disappear, the way orphan girls disappeared all the time on the frontier, and no one would notice and no one would care. Then, in early December, something changed. A storm struck. Not the worst, but bad enough. Temperature dropped to -8 degrees. Wind screamed across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving snow sideways in sheets so thick you couldn't see the horizon. The storm lasted 18 hours. Arne Lindgren lost 6 sheep, 6 animals frozen in his barn. His barn, the structure that had sheltered 84 head for 11 years without significant loss. The barn that represented everything he knew about surviving winter. The barn he had pointed to when he told Elsa she needed a proper cabin with walls that don't sweat. His walls had sweated. His sheep had frozen. Elsa heard the news from Marta, who heard it from the general store, where Lindgren had gone for whiskey after burying the carcasses. He doesn't understand it, Marta said. The barn held last winter and the winter before, but this storm, the wind found gaps. Snow drifted through cracks. The animals couldn't get away from it. They huddled in a corner and froze there. Elsa thought about her bunker. No wind, no gaps, no drifting snow. A stray cat had found her 2 weeks earlier, a half-wild thing with matted fur and yellow eyes. It slept in the corner of the bunker and caught mice. The cat was fat now, thriving, warmer than it had ever been in its life. Lindgren's barn had walls, a roof, everything a shelter was supposed to have, and his animals died while her cat purred. What if the barn was the problem? The thought wouldn't leave her alone. She knew nothing about sheep, nothing about livestock, nothing about farming, but she knew her bunker held warmth that no wooden building could match. She knew the earth was a blanket 4 feet thick. She knew that somewhere out there, 40 below, was waiting. Late December. The mild weather held. Children played outside without coats. Farmers worked in shirt sleeves, mending equipment for spring planting. The old-timers watched the sky with worried faces and said nothing because there was nothing to say. They could feel it building. They just couldn't see it yet. "Winters this soft don't stay soft," Marta said one evening, when she'd come by with a package of dried beef and an excuse about needing help with her accounts. "The cold is building somewhere. When it breaks, it'll break hard." January 11th, 1888. Morning temperature 42 degrees. Warmer than Christmas. Warmer than Thanksgiving. So warm that Elsa walked outside without her coat and let the sun touch her face for the first time in weeks. But something felt wrong. The air tasted different. Heavy, electric, like the air before a summer thunderstorm, but cold. The animals in Marta's barn were restless. She could hear them from half a mile away, their cries carrying on the still air. Birds had vanished from the sky. No crows, no sparrows, nothing. Elsa spent the day gathering dried grass. She didn't know why. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that had made her dig deeper to test the earth's warmth. The same instinct that had made her drag cottonwood beams 3 miles instead of walking to the poorhouse. Something was coming. She didn't know how bad. No one did. January 12th, 1888. The morning dawned warm. Farmers across Wrenwood County woke to temperatures in the high 30s, warm enough that children skipped to school without coats, their breath barely visible in the mild air. The sun rose into a clear sky, pale blue and endless. The snow that remained from earlier storms began to soften and drip from rooftops, leaving dark patches on the frozen ground below. It felt like spring. It felt like mercy. It felt like a gift after months of cold. By 10 o'clock, the temperature had climbed to 42 degrees. Women hung laundry on lines for the first time since November. Men worked on equipment in shirt sleeves, mending harnesses and sharpening blades for a spring that suddenly felt possible. A farmer 3 miles south of Birch Coulee decided to slaughter a hog he'd been keeping alive through the winter. The warm air would keep the meat from freezing too fast, would let him work without his fingers going numb. Children ran through the remaining snowdrifts, their laughter carrying across the flat prairie like bells. Teachers at the one-room schoolhouses opened windows to let in fresh air. The world had softened. No one looked northwest. No one saw the wall of black rising on the horizon like something from the book of Revelation. Elsa noticed it first because she had nothing else to do but watch the sky. She stood outside her bunker at 11 o'clock, letting the warmth touch her face, feeling the sun on skin that had been wrapped in wool and darkness for months. She had come outside to check the drainage channels. The warm temperatures could mean melt, and melt could mean flooding. And that's when she saw it. The darkness gathered beyond the distant line of trees along the creek. It stretched across the northwest horizon like a bruise spreading across skin. It looked wrong. Not like a cloud, not like smoke, but like something solid, something with weight, something coming. She watched it for several minutes, trying to understand what she was seeing. Storm clouds didn't move like that. Storm clouds billowed and shifted. This thing was a wall, a barrier, a curtain being drawn across the world. She went inside and began stuffing grass around the edges of her door. At 1 o'clock, the wind changed. It had been blowing gently from the south all morning, carrying the warm air that had fooled everyone into believing winter was over. Now it stopped completely. The air went still. The grass on the prairie stood motionless. The silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the blood moving through her veins. The darkness on the horizon had grown. It stretched from north to west now, filling a quarter of the sky, then a third. And it was moving faster than any cloud she had ever seen, moving faster than a horse could run. Elsa brought extra grass inside. She checked the seals on the walls. She made sure the water bucket was full. Once the storm hit, she wouldn't be able to reach the creek. At approximately 2 o'clock in Wrenwood County, later in some places, earlier in others, depending on the exact path of the front, the wall of black struck. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes. Elsa felt it through the walls of her bunker, a shudder in the air, a pressure change that made her ears pop like she was descending a deep mine. The warmth vanished as if someone had opened a door to a meat locker. Outside, the world turned white, snow driven sideways at 60 miles per hour, so thick that the sky and the ground became the same color, the same nothing. Visibility dropped to 0 in seconds. The warm air that had coaxed children outside without coats was replaced by air so cold it burned the lungs, so cold it could freeze the moisture in a man's eyes. The wind screamed, not howled, screamed. A high keening sound that rose and fell like something alive and hungry. Within an hour, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees. By evening, it would reach minus 22. By midnight, minus 47. Elsa sealed her door and pressed her back against it and listened to the wind try to tear the world apart. The knock came at 2:30. She almost didn't hear it over the wind. A pounding, desperate, rhythmic, not the random battering of debris, but something intentional. Someone beating on the earth above the entry with something wooden, a branch maybe, or a tool handle. Someone trying to be heard through 4 feet of packed soil. Elsa hesitated. Opening the door meant letting in the cold. It meant risking everything she had built. everything she had survived for. The temperature outside was already below freezing and falling fast. Every second the door was open, warmth would pour out and cold would pour in. The pounding continued, faster now, frantic, the rhythm of someone who was dying and knew it. She pulled away the hide flap and pushed open the wooden door. A girl tumbled through, 12 years old, maybe 13, her face red with windburn and already showing the white patches of early frostbite. Her hands were blue. Her dress was soaked through with driven snow that had melted against her body and was now refreezing. Behind her, animals poured into the opening. Goats, sheep, pushing and bleeding, their eyes wild with terror. The wind screamed through the gap, driving snow into the bunker, stealing the warmth that had taken months to build. The girl grabbed Elsa's arm with fingers that felt like ice wrapped in skin. "I couldn't get home," she gasped. Her teeth chattered so badly she could barely form words. "The storm. I was bringing the animals back from the south pasture. I couldn't see anything. The snow. I couldn't see my own hands. I remembered the bunker. I remembered you." Elsa counted the animals as they crowded past. 7 goats scrambling over each other, 4 sheep pushing through with their thick wool already crusted with ice. 11 animals total, not counting the half-wild cat that had been sleeping in the corner and was now backed against the far wall, hissing at the chaos. "Who are you?" "Ingrid. Ingrid Eriksson, Marta's daughter." Marta, the woman who had brought cheese and bread when Elsa was starving, the woman who had given her lumber disguised as inconvenience, the woman who had warned her about water flooding dugouts, and who had never stopped checking on her, even when everyone else had written her off. Marta's daughter was going to die if Elsa turned her away. "Close the door," Elsa said. "Help me seal it." Together they wrestled the door shut against the wind. Elsa packed grass into the gaps, shoved dirt against the base, worked with hands that were already going numb from the brief exposure. The cold had poured in like water through a broken dam. The temperature inside the bunker had dropped 10 degrees in 30 seconds, but the door was closed now. The wind was outside, and they were underground. The bunker had been built for soldiers carrying gunpowder, 20 men maybe, crouching in the darkness during a siege, waiting for the shooting to stop. It had never been meant for 2 girls and 11 animals and a cat. The space was chaos. Goats climbed on the sleeping platform, their hooves clattering on the salvaged boards. Sheep huddled in corners, their thick wool steaming as it absorbed the warmer air, their bleating echoing off the earthen walls. The cat yowled from somewhere in the darkness, and Ingrid collapsed against the wall, shaking so badly her entire body seemed to vibrate. "I was a mile from home when the storm hit," she said through chattering teeth. "I tried to keep walking. I knew the direction. I thought I knew. But the snow, it was everywhere. I couldn't see the horizon. I couldn't see the ground. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. The animals started dying." Her voice broke. One of the goats, the little brown one, the one Mother named Pepper, she just fell down. She fell down in the snow and didn't get up. I tried to pull her, I tried to carry her, but she was already stiff, she was already frozen, so I left her. I left her behind. Elsa pulled the girl close, sharing body heat, feeling the ice in Ingrid's clothes begin to melt against her own dress. "You got 11 here. You saved 11. There were 15. Ingrid's voice was barely a whisper. 15 animals. I lost 4. 4 animals dead in the time it took to walk a mile. 4 animals frozen in a storm that had arrived without warning, that had turned a spring morning into a killing ground in minutes. Outside, the wind had reached a pitch that sounded less like weather and more like rage. The door shuddered in its frame. Elsa had built it from salvaged lumber, Good boards fitted tight, but the wind found every gap, every imperfection, every place where the wood didn't quite meet. She stuffed grass into the cracks. She piled dirt against the base. She worked until her fingers were raw and bleeding, and the sound of the wind was muffled enough to think. 3 o'clock. Temperature outside. Approximately 10 degrees and falling. The bunker's interior held steady at 44 degrees. 14 bodies now. 2 human, 11 livestock, 1 cat. 14 sources of heat, all breathing, all living, all pouring warmth into the enclosed space. The animals generated heat through digestion. The goats and sheep were ruminants, their multiple stomachs constantly fermenting grass into energy, constantly producing warmth. The earth above them was a blanket 4 feet thick. The walls were packed clay and ancient logs, impervious to wind. The floor was lined with 8 inches of dried grass that held warmth like a grandmother holding a secret. They were underground. They were buried alive. They were warm. At 6 o'clock, the temperature outside dropped below 0. Elsa knew this because the quality of the cold changed. Even underground, even insulated by 4 feet of earth, she could feel it. A pressure, a weight, a presence pressing against the walls of the bunker like something trying to break through. The air outside had become a weapon. The air outside had become death. Ingrid had stopped shaking. She sat among the goats now, her body heat mingling with theirs, her face slowly returning from the mottled red and white of frostbite to something closer to normal. One of the goats had laid its head in her lap and was sleeping. Another had pressed against her side like a dog seeking comfort. The sheep had settled into a corner, packed so tight they looked like one animal with 22 legs. Their wool insulated them from the cold, but more than that, their bodies insulated each other. They had done this for thousands of years, sheep had, huddled together in storms, survived by sharing warmth. The cat had claimed a spot on the sleeping platform and was grooming itself with elaborate unconcern, as if blizzards that killed were ordinary occurrences not worth acknowledging. "How did you know?" Ingrid asked. "Know what?" "That this would work. That the bunker would hold." Elsa sat against the earthen wall, feeling the cool solidity of it against her back. The wall was not warm, exactly. It was cool, always cool, the same temperature year-round, but it was not freezing. It would never freeze. The earth at this depth held the memory of all the seasons averaged together, and that average was enough. "I didn't know," she said finally. "I guessed. I hoped. I dragged cottonwood beams 3 miles and sealed 47 gaps and slept alone in the dark for months because the alternative was dying above ground." "But you believed it would work." "I believed the earth held warmth. The old women in New York used to say that. The earth remembers summer. I figured if the root cellars never froze in Manhattan, maybe a bunker wouldn't freeze in Minnesota." "That's all? That's all you had?" "That's all anyone has. An idea, a guess, the willingness to find out if you're wrong." 1.5 miles east, Arne Lindgren was learning that he had been wrong for 30 years. His barn had held through 11 winters. Wooden walls, wooden roof, gaps stuffed with straw for insulation. He had built it himself in 1877, using lumber shipped from Minneapolis at considerable expense. It was the largest barn in Renwood County, the best maintained, the most carefully designed. He had 84 sheep in that barn, 12 cattle, a lifetime of work. At 6 o'clock on January 12th, the wind found the barn's weaknesses. The west wall had been repaired twice, once after a storm in 1883, once after a horse kicked through a board in 1885. The repairs were adequate for normal weather. They had held through normal storms. But the wind of the children's blizzard was not normal. It was not weather anyone had prepared for because no one alive had seen weather like it. The wind found the seams where new boards met old. It found the gaps where straw insulation had settled and compressed. It found every imperfection and pried it wider. Snow began to drift through the west wall. Not much at first, a dusting on the floor, barely visible in the darkness. But the sheep noticed. Animals always notice. They moved away from the west wall, crowding toward the east, pressing against each other in growing panic. More snow poured through the gaps. The drift inside the barn grew, 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet of snow piling against the interior wall. Lindgren saw it happening and could do nothing. The wind was too strong to work outside. A man couldn't stand in it, couldn't see in it, couldn't survive in it for more than minutes. The barn door had frozen shut, the moisture in the wood turning to ice that welded the boards together. He could only stand inside his failing structure and watch as his animals pressed themselves against the east wall and the cold pressed in from the west. The temperature in the barn had been 40 degrees at 2 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, it was 20 degrees. By 10 o'clock, it was 5 degrees. The sheep began to freeze. They froze standing up, the ones closest to the collapsed section of wall. Their wool was wet from the driven snow, and wet wool has no insulating value. It pulls heat from the body instead of holding it in. They stood in the growing drift, and their legs stopped moving, and their eyes glazed over, and they became statues of ice and flesh. Lindgren tried to move them. He grabbed sheep by their wool and dragged them toward the east wall, toward the section of barn that was still holding. But there were 84 animals and 1 man, and the cold was everywhere now, and for every sheep he moved, another stopped moving. At midnight, the west wall collapsed. The weight of driven snow against the boards was more than the aging structure could bear. The wall didn't fall. It exploded inward, boards splintering, posts cracking, the whole section giving way at once. Snow and wind poured through the gap like water through a broken dam. The sheep stampeded. Some ran toward the door, still frozen shut. They piled against it, crushing each other, suffocating. Some ran toward the east wall. They made it, huddled there, survived for a few more hours until the cold found them too. Some ran directly into the storm. Lindgren screamed at them, fought them, tried to herd them back into what remained of the barn. But the animals were blind with terror, deaf to anything but the wind, driven by instincts that said run, run, run away from the killing cold. They ran into the white void and vanished. He found 3 of them, an hour later, huddled against a fence post 50 yards from the barn, frozen solid. Their wool was rimed with ice an inch thick. Their eyes were open, staring at nothing. They had died standing up, still trying to walk, still trying to escape. 2 o'clock in the morning, January 13th, 1888. The temperature outside had reached its lowest point, minus 47 degrees at Moorhead, and similar readings across the region. The cold was so intense that trees exploded, the sap inside them freezing, expanding, splitting the trunks with sounds like gunshots. The cold was so intense that metal burned exposed skin on contact. The cold was so intense that a man's spit would freeze before it hit the ground. The wind had slowed slightly, but the cold had deepened into something that felt permanent, something that felt like it would never end. Inside the bunker, Elsa woke from a half-sleep to silence. Not true silence. The wind still moaned outside, a low, endless sound like grief. The animals still breathed and shifted, their bodies a warm mass of wool and fur and life. But a different quality of sound, muffled, distant, like the world above had been wrapped in cotton. She checked the door. It was buried. Snow had drifted against it during the night, packing tight against the wood, sealing them in. She pushed against the door, and it didn't move. She pushed harder. Nothing. For a moment, panic flared in her chest. They were trapped, no way out. If the bunker caught fire, if someone got sick, if the air ran out, if the earth decided to collapse. But the air wasn't running out. The earth above them was porous enough to let oxygen seep through. She had learned that over months of living here. She wasn't suffocating, she wasn't dying, and they weren't going to freeze. The interior temperature had dropped to 36 degrees, cold enough to see their breath in the lamplight, cold enough to make the sheep huddle tighter, but nowhere near deadly. The earth mass above them had absorbed warmth all through the fall, storing the heat of summer in its dense clay and soil, and now it was releasing that warmth slowly, steadily, like a grandmother telling a story that would last all winter. Elsa checked on the animals, all 11 alive. The goats were sleeping in a pile, their bodies intertwined, their breath coming slow and even. The sheep had pressed into their corner so tightly she couldn't count individual bodies. The cat had claimed the warmest spot in the bunker, a depression in the grass bedding where body heat collected, and was sleeping with its paws tucked beneath its chest. Ingrid was awake, watching her. "I dreamed the storm was over," Ingrid said. "I dreamed we walked outside and the sun was shining." "It's not over yet." "I know." She paused. "But we're going to survive, aren't we?" Elsa looked at the earthen walls, at the massive timbers above them, at the 4 feet of packed soil that separated them from the killing cold. She thought about Arne Lindgren and his wooden barn. She thought about the poorhouse in New Ulm, where children died in the night. She thought about Mrs. Halverson bleeding out while she watched, helpless. "Yes," she said, "we're going to survive." The storm broke at dawn. Elsa heard it first, a change in the wind's pitch, a lessening of pressure against the buried door. The moan became a whisper, then a murmur, then silence. Real silence. The silence of a world exhausted by violence. She dug through the snow with her bare hands, pushing and scraping at the packed drift until her fingers bled. Ingrid helped, working beside her, both of them gouging away at the white barrier. The snow was dense, wind-packed, almost like ice, but they dug and dug until light appeared. Cold light. Hard light. The blue-white light of a winter dawn. Elsa pushed through the last of the drift and emerged into a white wasteland. The prairie had been transformed. Snow lay in drifts 10 feet high, sculpted by wind into shapes that looked almost intentional, curves and waves and ridges like a frozen ocean. The familiar landmarks were gone, buried or erased. The air was still brutally cold, minus 31 degrees, but the wind had stopped. The sky was blue, pale and distant. The sun was rising, turning the snow pink and gold. Steam poured from the bunker opening as warm air met cold, a plume of vapor rising from a hole in the ground, marking the place where 14 living creatures had survived a night that had killed hundreds across the prairie. The animals emerged behind her, blinking and cautious. 7 goats testing the frozen ground with careful hooves, their breath steaming. 4 sheep crowding through the opening, their wool pristine and dry, their eyes clear. The cat emerged last, looked at the snow with undisguised contempt, and immediately retreated back into the warmth. Ingrid climbed out and stood beside Elsa, staring at the devastation. The silence was immense. Nothing moved, nothing called. The birds were gone, the rabbits were gone. Everything alive was either dead or hiding. "We made it," Ingrid said. Elsa didn't answer. She was looking toward the east, toward the Lindgren farm. She could see smoke rising, not the smoke of a cooking fire. That smoke would be thin and white, wood smoke curling from a chimney. This smoke was thick and dark and wrong. The smoke of something large burning. Bodies, maybe. Carcasses. A barn. "Stay here," she told Ingrid. Keep the animals close. Don't let them wander into the drifts. She walked east, following the ridge where the snow was shallow enough to pass. She found Arne Lindgren at 10 o'clock, standing in the wreckage of his life. The barn was destroyed. The west wall had collapsed completely, and the east wall had followed sometime during the night, unable to bear the unbalanced load. What remained was a skeleton of posts and beams, ribs of a dead animal jutting toward the sky. Snow filled the interior, packed tight around the bodies of the sheep that hadn't escaped. They were everywhere, frozen in the snow, frozen against the walls, frozen in piles where they had huddled for warmth that never came. Some had died standing up, their legs locked in the moment of their last step. Some had died lying down, their heads resting on each other's bodies as if sleeping. Some had died running, their frozen corpses half buried in drifts yards from the barn. Lindgren stood in the middle of the wreckage. He wasn't moving, wasn't digging, wasn't counting, just standing. When Elsa approached, he didn't look up. 53, he said. His voice was flat, hollow. 53 sheep dead, 8 cattle. I started with 84 head and 12 cattle. Now I have 31 sheep and 4 cattle. Elsa said nothing. I've got 31 animals left, 31 out of 96. He kicked at a drift of snow, revealing a frozen sheep beneath it. The animal's eyes were still open, still staring at nothing. My barn held for 11 years. 11 years. And in one night, he stopped. His hands were shaking. His whole body was shaking. The wind found the gaps. The snow found the gaps. Everything I built, everything I knew, it wasn't enough. I stuffed those walls with straw. I sealed every crack I could find. I did everything right. He finally looked at her. His face was haggard, the face of a man who had aged 10 years in one night. His eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from cold or tears or simple exhaustion, Elsa couldn't tell. What about you? He asked. What about your hole in the ground? 11 animals, Elsa said. 7 goats, 4 sheep. Marta Eriksson's daughter brought them during the storm. She couldn't make it home. And? All 11 survived. So did Ingrid. So did I. Lindgren stared at her. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind gusting through the barn skeleton, filled with the bodies of animals that had died because their shelter wasn't shelter at all. I told you, he said slowly. I told you that you would freeze in that hole. I told you every creature you dragged down there would freeze with you. I remember. I said a woman alone can't survive a Dakota winter. I said you needed a proper cabin and 60 cords of firewood and a man to cut it. I remember that too. I was wrong. The words came hard, each one torn from somewhere deep. I've been surviving winters for 30 years and I've been doing it wrong. My barn had walls and a roof and everything a shelter is supposed to have. Your hole had dirt and logs and nothing else. And your animals walked out this morning while mine. He gestured at the frozen bodies. The earth doesn't forget warmth, he said. I forgot that. I forgot what my grandfather knew. He built a sod house when he came to this country back in 53. We all thought we were smarter now. We thought lumber was better. We were wrong. Elsa didn't know what to say. She had never expected an apology. She had never expected acknowledgement. She had expected to die in that bunker, dismissed and forgotten. Lindgren turned back to his ruined barn. For a long moment, he said nothing. I have 31 animals left, he said finally. Nowhere to shelter them. The next storm will finish what this one started. He didn't ask. He didn't beg. He just waited, his back to her, his shoulders hunched against a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "There's room," Elsa said. "If we expand the entry, if we dig out another section of the bunker, the earth goes deep. The warmth goes deep." Lindgren nodded once. He didn't turn around. He didn't say thank you. He just started walking toward the bunker, his boots crunching through the frozen crust, moving with the slow determination of a man who had just learned that everything he knew was wrong. By the end of January, the word had spread throughout Wrenwood County. The orphan train girl, the one who lived in Lindgren's grave, had sheltered 42 animals through the worst of the winter. Lindgren himself had helped expand the entry, digging through frozen earth with picks and shovels, widening the space until it could hold his remaining flock alongside Elsa's original 11. The interior temperature never dropped below 34 degrees. Outside, storms continued to hammer the prairie, another blizzard on January 20th, another on February 3rd. Temperatures plunged to -40 and beyond, but underground, the earth held. The earth remembered summer, even in the depths of February. Farmers came to see for themselves. They stood at the entry of the bunker and watched sheep walking calmly in and out, their wool clean and dry, their bodies healthy. They felt the warmth rising from the opening like breath from a living thing. They shook their heads in disbelief. "How deep is the earth?" they asked. 4 feet, Elsa told them. 4 feet of packed soil above the timbers. That's the key. Not walls, not wood. Earth. "How do you keep the air fresh?" "The earth breathes. The soil is porous. Air moves through it slowly, but it moves. You can feel it if you're quiet enough. Put your hand against the wall and wait." "What about water? What about flooding?" "You have to know the land, where the water runs, where it doesn't. Dig in the wrong place and the spring melt will drown you. Dig in the right place and you'll be dry as a Methodist church." She drew diagrams in the snow for families who couldn't read, rough sketches showing how the timbers should be laid, how the earth should be mounded, how the entry should face away from the prevailing wind. She walked neighboring farms to help site new dugouts for livestock, testing the soil with a stick, checking for water by digging test holes. When they offered payment, she refused. "The cold doesn't ask for money," she said. "Neither do I." Marta Erickson came to the bunker on February 1st, driving her sledge through snow that reached her horses' chests. Her face was red from cold and something else, something that looked like shame mixed with relief. "You saved my daughter," she said. "She found her own way. I just had a door to open." "You had more than a door." Marta climbed down from the sledge and stood in the snow, looking at the entrance to the bunker, at the steam rising from the earth, at the tracks of animals coming and going, at the hole in the ground that had become a sanctuary. "You had walls the cold couldn't touch. You had shelter that didn't need fire to hold warmth." She paused. "When I gave you that lumber," she said, "I thought I was helping you die more slowly. I thought you'd last a little longer with a proper door. I never thought you'd use it to build something that actually worked." "You thought I'd fail?" "Everyone thought you'd fail. A 14-year-old orphan girl alone in a hole with nothing but $3 and stubbornness." Marta shook her head. "I doubted the walls would hold against water. I worried about spring flooding. I never thought about whether they'd hold against cold. You understood something I didn't." "The earth holds summer," Elsa said. "That's all. My mother used to say it. The old women in the tenements used to say it. It's not complicated." "No, but it's something the rest of us forgot." Marta looked at the bunker for a long moment. "My grandfather built a half-underground house in Norway. When we came to America, my father built one too, in Wisconsin. Then we moved here, and everyone was building wooden houses, wooden barns, because that's what Americans did. We forgot what we knew. You can remember again. Marta reached into her sledge and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a dress, heavy wool, dark blue, sized for a girl who had grown taller over the winter. For you, Marta said, trade for what you taught me. This time, Elsa didn't argue about charity. Agnes Halverson never came to the bunker. She never acknowledged what Elsa had done. When others spoke of the orphan train girl who had saved the town's livestock, Agnes sat in silence. When the Lutheran church in Birch Coulee held a service of thanksgiving for those who had survived the blizzard, Agnes sat in the back pew and kept her eyes on her hymnal. Someone asked her, afterward, what she thought about the girl who had predicted the earth would hold. God protects the simple-minded, Agnes said. Even a stopped clock is right twice a day. She never apologized. She never admitted she was wrong. She went on living in the house she had shared with her brother, watching the prairie through windows that faced away from the bunker, pretending that Elsa Gunnarsdottir did not exist. Some doubts don't convert. They simply go silent. But silence was enough. Elsa didn't need Agnes's blessing. She didn't need acknowledgement from people who had wished her dead. She had her bunker. She had her name. She had survived. That was more than $3.40. That was everything. By spring of 1888, 7 farms in Wrenwood County had dug earth-sheltered livestock bunkers. Elsa helped site 4 of them herself, walking the land with farmers who had once refused to meet her eyes, showing them where the water table ran shallow and where clay held firm. She asked nothing in return. Lindgren donated the first lumber payment, he said, for lessons he should have learned 30 years earlier. By the following winter, the method had spread to 2 neighboring counties. The bunkers were called storm cellars by some, earth barns by others. The children of Wrenwood County called them Elsa's holes. None of them froze. Elsa Gunnarsdottir lived in her bunker until 1892, when she married a Norwegian immigrant named Carl Nygaard. He had come to Minnesota specifically because he heard about a girl who understood how to build with earth instead of against it. They homesteaded together in Murray County, and their farmhouse, built half underground in a hillside, stood for 55 years. Elsa bore 4 children and buried one to influenza in 1918. She never stopped teaching the method, never stopped drawing diagrams in snow and dirt for anyone who wanted to learn. She died in February 1931 at 72 years old in the same earth-sheltered house where she had spent nearly 40 winters. The day she died, the outside temperature was minus 28 degrees. The interior of her home held 51. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. Arne Lindgren, who had survived 11 Dakota winters and buried 2 wives to the prairie, had told Elsa Gunnarsdottir that a girl living in a grave could not keep herself alive. When the real cold comes, he said, you'll freeze in that hole, and every creature you've dragged down there will freeze with you. The real cold came, 47 degrees below zero, wind that tore barns apart and froze sheep standing upright in the snow. Lindgren's barn collapsed. His animals died where they stood. But in Elsa's hole, in the bunker the town had dismissed as a grave, 11 animals walked out into the frozen morning, breath steaming, bodies warm, alive. The earth did not forget summer, even in January. Elsa Gunnarsdottir, 14 years old, $3.40 to her name, had understood something that survivors hadn't. The ground holds warmth, even when everything above it dies.